Nobody in Caldwell County believed a 19-year-old could grow anything on 40 acres of broken limestone. When Eli Tanner's uncle died and left him that rock-choked field instead of cash, 3 neighbors laughed out loud at the reading of the will. One of them, a man named Dale Purnell who farmed 600 acres of the best bottomland in the township, offered Eli $4,000 for it that same afternoon. Sight unseen, just to be kind, he said. Eli turned him down. By October, that field would be the only reason the county extension office had to call an emergency meeting. The land sat on the western edge of Caldwell County, Kentucky, a stretch of ground so scarred with limestone outcroppings that older farmers called it the Knuckles. Eli's uncle, Ray Tanner, had bought it decades earlier for almost nothing, cleared what he could by hand, and mostly left it alone, running a few goats across it and calling it good enough. When Ray passed that spring, the will surprised everyone. Eli's cousins got the house and the equipment. Eli, the quiet nephew who'd spent every summer since he was 12 hauling feed and mending fence for his uncle, got the rock field. Eli was 19, built lean from years of farm labor, with a way of listening more than talking that made grown men underestimate him. He'd graduated high school the year before and had been working part-time at a feed store in town, saving toward nothing in particular. His mother worried about him taking on land that couldn't even hold a garden, let alone a crop. His father had left when Eli was 7, and there wasn't much family money to fall back on if the field failed him. But Eli remembered something his uncle used to say while they walked that ground together, that limestone held water different than people thought, that the rock underneath was full of old sinkholes and channels that kept moisture close even in a dry August. Ray had never proven it. He'd never had the years left to try. Eli had inherited more than dirt. He'd inherited a hunch and 40 acres to test it on. He moved into the small cabin near the property line that June, with a used tractor he'd bought on payments and $1,100 in a coffee can. The neighbors watched him haul the first loads of stone off a 2-acre section near the creek, stacking them into low walls along the fence line, and they shook their heads the way people do when they've already decided how a thing will end. By July, word had gotten around the co-op that the Tanner boy was trying to plant corn on rock. Dale Purnell brought it up at the feed store, loud enough for Eli to hear from the next aisle, joking that Ray Tanner had finally found a way to punish somebody from the grave. A few men laughed along. Nobody meant real cruelty by it. Mostly it was the kind of talk men make about anything unfamiliar, the kind that costs nothing to say and everything to hear. Eli didn't argue. He paid for his fence staples and left. But the talk didn't stop at the store. It followed him to the county extension office, where he'd gone hoping for soil testing help. The agent on duty, a heavy-set man named Roy Whitfield who'd worked that office for 18 years, looked over Eli's soil samples for about 90 seconds before pushing them back across the desk. "Son, that ground's been rejected by 3 generations of Tanners before you," Roy said. "I wouldn't sink money you don't have into proving them wrong." Eli asked if the office could still run the pH test, since he'd already paid the $12 fee. Roy ran it, mostly to be done with the conversation, and the results came back unremarkable, nothing that explained why anyone would bother. He handed Eli the paper without much comment and moved on to the next farmer waiting behind him, a man with 400 acres and an appointment that mattered more. Eli drove home with the results folded in his shirt pocket. He didn't need Roy Whitfield's blessing. He needed water and depth and time, 3 things nobody at that office had bothered to measure. He started where his uncle had left off, but slower, and with more attention than Ray ever had time for. Each morning before the heat set in, Eli walked sections of the field with a post-hole digger, sinking test holes 18 inches down in a dozen different spots, filling small mason jars with soil from each depth and labeling them with a grease pencil. 2 inches, 8 inches, 16 inches. Lining them up on a shelf in the cabin like a row of specimens nobody else cared to look at. The first jars told him what he already suspected. The top layer was thin and rocky, barely worth planting in. But 8 inches down, the soil turned dark and held together when he squeezed it, damp even after 9 dry days. He marked that section on a hand-drawn map with a red X. The second discovery came from the creek that cut along the property's north edge. Eli noticed it ran low most of the summer but never fully dried, even during the driest stretch in early July when Purnell's own pond had dropped 2 feet. He traced the creek's path against the limestone outcroppings and began to understand what his uncle had meant. The rock wasn't blocking water. It was storing it, releasing it slow, like the whole field sat over something closer to a sponge than a wall. Third, he found an old drainage tile buried near the fence line, half crushed and forgotten. Clay pipe laid by whoever had farmed the land 2 owners before his uncle. He dug it out by hand over 2 afternoons, cleared it of 40 years of silt, and reset 30 feet of it before connecting it to a new run he laid himself. Water that had been pooling uselessly against a rock shelf started moving instead, feeding down toward the section he'd marked with the red X. By late July, Eli had cleared just under 6 acres of surface stone, using the rock to build low retaining walls that slowed runoff instead of letting it sheet off into the creek. He planted that 6 acres in field corn on the 4th of August, later than any of his neighbors, using seed left over from a bulk order at the co-op that a bigger farm hadn't needed. He kept his jars on the shelf, refilling a few of them every 2 weeks, watching how the moisture held even as the surrounding pastures browned out under the summer sun. Nobody came to check on him. Nobody asked how the corn was doing. He worked mostly in silence, some mornings with a border collie mix he'd taken in as a stray, and some evenings just him and the sound of the creek that never quite dried up. By late August, the county was deep into a dry spell that had every farmer in Caldwell talking about irrigation costs and thinning stands. Dale Purnell's 600 acres, planted in the same corn variety 3 weeks earlier than Eli's, started showing stress in the lower leaves by the 2nd week of the month, a sign every farmer recognized, and nobody liked to see this early in the season. Purnell wasn't worried, not out loud anyway. He told the men at the co-op that his corn had weathered worse droughts than this one, that a Massey Ferguson combine and 40 years of experience would carry him through same as always. He wasn't wrong to trust his record. He'd never lost a crop badly enough to remember what it felt like. But the cracks were there for anyone paying close attention. Purnell's irrigation pivot broke down twice in 10 days, and the repair bill from the dealer came to $1,100 the second time. On top of the diesel he was burning running it around the clock. His pond, the one that fed 2 of his fields, had dropped low enough that his hired hand mentioned it might not last through September if the dry spell held. Meanwhile, on the rock field, the corn Eli had planted was holding a green Roy Whitfield hadn't expected. Not tall, nobody would call it tall, but even and standing and pulling moisture from somewhere the surrounding fields didn't have access to. Eli didn't tell anyone. He kept refilling his jars, kept walking the rows at dawn, and kept his numbers to himself, because he'd learned by then that nobody in town wanted to hear it from him yet. They wanted to see it. Roy Whitfield drove past the field twice that month on his way to other appointments. The second time, he slowed the truck down at the fence line for almost a full minute before driving on. He didn't stop. He didn't have anything to say yet either. The harvest came in the 2nd week of October. Eli ran the corn through a rented combine he'd arranged weeks in advance, working the 6 acres alone over 2 days because he couldn't afford a crew. When the yield monitor settled on its final number, he sat in the cab for a moment without moving. 191 bushels per acre. On rock ground 3 generations of his own family had written off as worthless. Dale Purnell's yield, once the dust settled from a drought that had cost him 2 irrigation repairs and a burned-out well pump, came in at 138 bushels per acre, respectable by most year standards, but well below what he'd predicted at planting, when he told the co-op he expected close to 180 on ground that had never let him down before. Roy Whitfield came out to the field himself once word started moving through town, standing at the edge of the 6 acres with the yield receipt in his hand, saying nothing for a long moment. He'd spent 18 years telling farmers what their ground could and couldn't do. He didn't apologize. He just asked, quietly, how deep Eli had dug those test holes, and wrote the answer down on the back of a co-op receipt, because he didn't have anything else on him. At $4.85 a bushel that week, Eli's 6 acres cleared him just over $5,500. On land his own family had offered up as a joke, on ground Purnell had once tried to buy for $4,000 outright, sight unseen, just to spare a young man the trouble of trying. The story moved through Caldwell County the way these things do, slow at first, then all at once. By the following week, 2 neighboring farmers had asked Eli to walk their low ground and tell them what he saw in it. He didn't have much to say beyond what he'd already done. Dig deeper than you think you need to, and pay attention to what the water's already trying to tell you. Dale Purnell never brought up the $4,000 offer again. He did, without much comment, ask Eli what seed variety he'd used, and Eli told him plainly, the same way his uncle would have. Eli kept his jars on the shelf through the winter. He didn't sell the field, didn't rent it out, didn't do anything that made for a better story than the truth, which was that he cleared another 4 acres of stone that November and started planning for spring. If you've ever been handed something everyone else called worthless and had to decide for yourself whether they were right, hit subscribe. We tell stories like Eli's every week. Quiet ones. About people who didn't wait for permission to prove what they already suspected. There's more of them coming, and you won't want to miss the next one. That October, the 6 acres of corn stubble sat next to 2 acres of raw limestone Eli hadn't cleared yet. Side by side, one proven and one still waiting. He liked it that way. It reminded him the field wasn't finished being an argument. It was just further along in one than it used to be. Some evenings he still walked out to the creek that never dried, past the low stone walls he'd built with his own hands, and stood there without doing much of anything, the way his uncle used to. The ground hadn't changed. Only what people were willing to believe about it had.